All right, can everybody hear me? Cool, if you can hear me, just kind of wrap up your conversation. We're going to get started. All right, let's do this. Thank you all so much. My name is Lauren Velazquez. I am the head debate coach for Niles North High School right outside of Chicago. Oddly enough, I never thought I'd have anything in common with Putin, but like Dr. Chase mentioned, I also love the 90s. I myself attended Classic in the 90s, if you want to do the math and figure out how old I am, and debated for Maine East, so shout out, I saw some Maine East debaters back there. And today I'm going to do what feels like the impossible task, and that is talk about all of Russian history and contextualize why Ukraine matters so much, why, in my opinion, it's completely predictable that we're in the situation that we're in now, what NATO has done so far, and perhaps more importantly for us as a debate community, what kind of questions this raises about the efficacy of NATO, where NATO should go going forward, and how does international law and international agreements really help us address problems in the modern age? So easy peasy, should be no problem covering all of that in an hour. I will give the caveat that I'm a relatively new student to Russian history. My expertise is Latin American history, but obviously the past few years, Russian history has piqued more and more of our interests. And so this slideshow will be shared out with you, and at the end, I put my brief bibliography, the 20 or so journal articles that I read to add to my education. And I really encourage you to check through, and there's also, I think, 4 or 5 extra videos that I put at the end that we are not going to have time to see. So if you want to dig deeper, you can check out the videos that are in the presentation, check out the articles that are attached to the bibliography. Some of the articles contain content that I think would make some pretty sweet cards if that's your jam. So let's do this. Boop, there you go. All right, so I've really broken this down into 4 things. The first is obviously the easiest, just all of modern Russian history, starting from 900 to the present day. Just to give you some context of how we got here, I'm a historian. I tend to think that humans are very predictable. Humans act in patterns, and the more that we understand the history, the more that we can understand how we got here and what our choices are going forward. I then want to talk a little bit about what has happened to Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union and what has been the complicated relationship with NATO as it watched this evolving situation in Ukraine. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about Ukraine war. I think we've all familiar with a little bit of what's going on. And then I want to leave some time at the end to talk about argument considerations and how we can integrate this knowledge into our debates. So let's do this. Oh, I will also give the caveat. Some of the slides have a lot of text, which is technically like a no-no in doing slide presentations, and I just couldn't figure out what to cut out. So I made sure on some of the slides where there is a lot of text, certain words are bolded or underlined. So if you are somebody who's compelled to always write down everything you see, no matter how good a flower you are, you're not going to be able to get down everything on the slide. So draw your eyes to the bolded words and the things that I visually say if you have to write down something. But otherwise, don't forget, it's going to be shared with you later. Cool. All right, let's do this. So warm-ups, sorry, I'm a teacher. I have to do warm-ups. You all know, especially after following Dr. Chase's lecture, a good amount about Russia and the Ukraine. So I think one thing I'd like to just hear from you, what do you know about why Ukraine? Why does Putin care about Ukraine? Why is it so important and significant? Yes?
Russia has historically wanted access to the Black Sea.
The Black Sea. I always talk about in my history class how waterways and the geography of where water is so important in history. It allows us to bring ships and goods and all that stuff, and the Black Sea is no different. Why else?
Because Ukraine was an important part of Russia back, in the USSR.
Yeah, so Ukraine was, almost the golden gem of the Soviet Union. Why else?
Stopping Russian aggression now, and then
Yeah, so the question is if we just say, all right, you can have the Ukraine, what's next? Are we going to find ourselves in another World War II situation where appeasement leads to total European conquest? What else?
Ukraine and Belarus are both very close to Moscow, and Belarus is already the puppets of the
Yeah, so geography matters. I do have a map up here. Let's see, do I know how to, is there a pointy? Oh, no, I did it wrong. Oh, go back. So I don't know, is there a pointy thing? Let's see. Oh yeah, pointy thing. So Ukraine, we're going to see Russia, which continues on into Asia. So geography definitely matters. And I saw one more.
So back in 800, when Russia was established, I think that you started something.
Yes, gold star for history reference. So we're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the history of what we think of as Russia. And the one thing I'll say to keep in mind as we dig in is we like to think of these borders as the way the world is. But for me, one of the most important things in understanding Russia and Ukraine and what's going on is the fact that these borders that we see are so new. Most of the borders in Europe, Asia, Africa are a century old at most. And there's disagreement over what a lot of those borders should be even to this day. So how do I define who is and isn't Russia and fits within the borders of Russia? How do I define who is and isn't Ukrainian and fits within the borders of this thing we call the Ukraine? So I have a short 5-minute video that is going to, I think it does a pretty good job of giving you 1,100 years of Russian history. The one thing I want you to pay attention to is it talks a lot about Kiev. You'll see the capital Ukrainian city, Kiev or Kiev, spelled differently depending on who's in control. But the video talks a lot about Kiev. And so hopefully you can start getting a sense of like why even from the very beginning, from 900, was Kiev, what we think of today as Ukraine, super important in the formation of the Russian people, the Russian identity, what it means to be Russian. So let's do this. All right, Russia, Ukraine, history. Boom. What does it mean to be Russian? I don't know. Let's see if I can make it bigger.
Where did Russia come from? Why is it so big? And what are the differences between it and its neighbors? The answers lie in an epic story of seafaring warriors, nomadic invaders, and the rise and fall of a medieval state known as Kievan Rus. In the first millennium, a large group of tribes spread through the dense woodlands of Eastern Europe. Because they had no writing system, much of what we know about them comes from 3 main sources: archaeological evidence, accounts from literate scholars of the Roman Empire and the Middle East, and lastly, an epic history called the Primary Chronicle, compiled in the 12th century by a monk named Nestor. What they tell us is that these tribes, who shared a common Slavic language and polytheistic religion, had by the 7th century split into western, southern, and eastern branches, the latter stretching from the Dniester River to the Volga and the Baltic Sea. As Nestor's story goes, after years of subjugation by Vikings from the north, who, by the way, did not wear horned helmets in battle, the region's tribes revolted and drove back the Northmen. But left to their own devices, they turned on each other. Such chaos ensued that, ironically, the tribes reached out to the foreigners they had just expelled, inviting them to return and establish order. The Vikings accepted, sending a prince named Rurik and his 2 brothers to rule. With Rurik's son Oleg expanding his realm into the south and moving the capital to Kiev, a former outpost of the Khazar Empire, the Kievan Rus was born. Rus most likely deriving from an Old Norse word for the men who rode. The new princedom had complex relations with its neighbors, alternating between alliance and warfare with the Khazar and Byzantine empires, as well as neighboring tribes. Religion played an important role in politics, and as the legend goes, in 987, the Rus prince Vladimir I decided it was time to abandon Slavic paganism and sent emissaries to explore neighboring faiths. Put off by Islam's prohibition on alcohol and Judaism's expulsion from its Holy Land, the ruler settled on Orthodox Christianity after hearing odd accounts of its ceremonies. With Vladimir's conversion and marriage to the Byzantine emperor's sister, as well as continued trade along the Volga route, the relationship between the two civilizations deepened. Byzantine missionaries created an alphabet for Slavic languages based on a modified Greek script, while Rus Viking warriors served as the Byzantine emperor's elite guard. For several generations, the Kievan Rus flourished from its rich resources and trade. Its noblemen and noblewomen married prominent European rulers, while residents of some cities enjoyed great culture, literacy, and even democratic freedoms uncommon for the time. But nothing lasts forever. Fratricidal disputes over succession began to erode central power, as increasingly independent cities ruled by rival princes vied for control. The Fourth Crusade and decline of Constantinople devastated the trade integral to Rus wealth and power, while Teutonic crusaders threatened northern territories. The final blow, however, would come from the east. Consumed by their squabbles, Rus princes paid little attention to the rumors of a mysterious, unstoppable horde until 1237, when 35,000 mounted archers, led by Batu Khan, swept through the Rus cities, sacking Kiev before continuing on to Hungary and Poland. The age of Kievan Rus had come to an end, its people now divided. In the east, which remained under Mongol rule, a remote trading post known as Moscow would grow to challenge the power of the Khans, conquering parts of their fragmenting empire, and in many ways succeeding it. As it absorbed other Eastern Rus territories, it reclaimed the old name in its Greek form, Russia. Meanwhile, the western regions, whose leaders had avoided destruction through political maneuvering until the horde withdrew, came under the influence of Poland and Lithuania. For the next few centuries, the former lands of Kievan Rus, populated by Slavs, ruled by Vikings, taught by Greeks, and split by Mongols, would develop differences in society, culture, and language that remain to the present day.
All right, so in this super broad overview, what did we learn about maybe why there's historical tensions between what we call Ukraine and Russia today? Yes, white sweatshirt. Yeah, we think of Moscow as really being the epicenter of all that is Russia, and when most people talk about modern Russian history, they talk about Moscow. But Moscow is a more remote part of the world, whereas Kiev is thriving. Agriculture has been able to exist there for centuries. So Kiev is kind of like the OG epicenter. Any other thoughts? Why this tension?
It also talked about like how at first Kiev and Rus was like perfectly fine, but then like it kind of split apart as different cities kind of vied for control.
Yeah, so, and I was going to show a John Green video, but I know working with students long enough that every time you show a John Green video, everyone groans. But I do love how John Green, he's a historian on YouTube, he talks a lot about the Mongols. And the Mongols were really kind of, what came in and took all these tensions that had already existed and really created a split in the people that had been somewhat unified before, and we see some people having a capital in Moscow and other people retaining Kiev as the capital. And again, this was over 1,000 years ago. So, yes, that was 1,000 years history in 5 minutes. Awesome, not every day you get to do that. Moving on. I like geography, it's super important. So again, when we talk about Kiev, Kiev is in the center of Ukraine. When we're going to talk about the Russian invasion this year, we're going to talk about the Russian troops coming in from the north, from Belarus, coming in from the south, from Crimea, and coming in over here. And then it's important to know that Ukraine is really a buffer between the rest of Europe. And if I had, the historian me is always keeping an eye on Poland, I think Poland is always the interesting historical question. It's kind of where Nazi Germany started its shenanigans. So I don't know, pay attention to Poland as you're researching NATO and what happens next. But, boop, nope, come on, no, this one, nope, nope, nope. All right, you're being picky, that's fine. Now their map, again, just to get a sense of Ukraine. And I think one thing that we forget about is how huge Ukraine is. I think when we think of European nations or when we think of Western Asian nations, we think of smaller nations. Nope, Ukraine is huge. One of the biggest nations in Europe. And we can see those of us like me that are Midwesterners and have ever driven through the Midwest, you know, that's a pretty big area of land. Ukraine would cover almost all of the Midwest. So we're talking about a huge swath of land in Europe, a good chunk of the continent. So again, don't write this all down, but if you have to write something down, I've highlighted in light green the things that I think are most important. And I think one of the things to remember is that after the whole shenanigans with the Mongols, the Russian Empire became the third largest empire in global history. So we talk a lot about the British Empire and the Mongol Empire and the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. But the Russian Empire actually expanded pretty quickly and controlled most of Asia. And so when Putin talks about like the historical Great Russia, historical Great Russia really dominated most of the continent, as you can see right here. And for a good 500-ish years, Russia was ruled with an imperial system like most of Europe. Instead of having kings and queens, they had czars and czarinas. You can read some crazy stories like Catherine the Great. She was interesting. There's some really cool stories about her, Peter the Great. So it's important to know just how powerful and large the Russian Empire was at its apex. World War I changed everything. And so I talked at the beginning about borders. World War I, as you might remember from your history class, erased a lot of the borders that empires had originally drawn up. But the problem is there wasn't always thought and consideration into how new nation-state borders were drawn. So for instance, the conflict in the Middle East today, completely predictable. Who drew most of the borders in the Middle East today? Anyone know? Yeah, England and France. So without any consultation to the people, without any knowledge of, you know, the difference between Sunni and Shia, without any knowledge about, you know, ethnic Kurds or anything, the British and the French came in and just drew the borders in the Middle East after World War I, after the Ottoman Empire fell. We see similar deals happening in as the Russian Empire falls, and I bring this up because it's important to know that a lot of these countries, like Poland, the Czech Republic, how old is this map? Austria, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, these are all relatively new nation states. Like, we're just coming on the century anniversary right now. And those of you that know your history know World War I was super interesting because while Russia was involved in World War I, they had to peace out early because they had their own revolution taking place. So while all of the great empires were falling because of World War I, the Russian Empire was actually falling because of internal conflict. And so this scrappy communist party, there's actually a bunch of different parties vying for power. They overthrew the imperial government of Russia. It's super interesting if you want to read about like the Romanov family and how like first they fled and they lived, I think, in a hotel and were, you know, that they were like imprisoned in a hotel for a year, and the brutality in which the Romanov family was finally murdered, and a lot of the elite throughout Russia were assassinated by the revolutionaries. But we see after some messy revolution that starts in 1917, this new concept of communist Russia forms. And pretty quickly, by 1922, Russia, this new communist state, starts to make friends with 15 Eurasian republics that are also very new around it and form the Soviet Union. So to date myself, I was in junior high when the Soviet Union fell, and I was really mad because for most of my education before that on geography tests, you just had to write Soviet Union for Asia, and it was like the easiest geography test ever. But then when the Soviet Union fell, suddenly you have all these independent countries of Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. But it's important to know that when we talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, we're talking about, for half a century, all of this territory in Eurasia really being controlled by one central authority based in Moscow. Like, sure, Kazakhstan was an independent republic, but they really had to follow the orders that were being handed down by the government in Moscow, whether it was led by Stalin, whether it was led by Khrushchev. And so the fall of the Soviet Union really created all of these new sources of power. One thing that I think is important to mention, and I think the video at the beginning gets a little bit to this, is that when we think of Russia, we think of like a unified culture, a unified language, and a unified history. But as most places in the world, that's not true. And so even though the Soviet Union was supposed to be this unified body, there still was a sense of who is and isn't a true Russian. And so the Soviet government was based in Moscow, in Russia, and there was a sense that there were parts in the Soviet Union where there were populations that were inferior. And Ukrainians were definitely thought of as an inferior, not true Russian population. And so Joseph Stalin had all of these great ideas of bringing communism to the Soviet Union, and one of his big plans involved taking all of the farms. They're now under control of the government, and the government says what is grown on the farm. The government collects what is produced. You can eat anything that's left over. But one of the disasters we see is that the government, either intentionally or not, was really not good at this process. And so we see, even though in places like Ukraine, a good amount of food is grown, instead of the people getting to eat that food, the government collects that food and ships it off to Western Europe, ships it off to Russia. And so even though Ukraine is considered like Europe's breadbasket, in 1932, there was a mass famine in Ukraine that historians overwhelmingly say was not caused by like nature or a dust bowl or anything, but it was caused because Stalin wouldn't let the people eat the food that they grew. And even today, more than 15 countries call this a historical genocide. We weren't using the word genocide yet. This is before World War II. But there is a very predominant belief, and I think that there's some merit to it, that Stalin was intentional about who he was taking food from, right? Like the people in Moscow weren't starving to death. But here we see, and it's hard, like we don't have exact numbers, but even at a lowball estimate of 4 million people dying of hunger, not because they're not growing food, but because they don't get to eat the food that they grow. And if you get caught eating the food before giving it to the government, that's imprisonment, that's execution. So I encourage you to like look more into the Holodomor famine. And so it's important, I think, to contextualize the fact that when we talk about human rights abuses geared towards the Ukrainian people, this is unfortunately not a new phenomenon. We're not going to spend a ton of time here. You've gotten hurt a couple times, but the NATO was formed, and the main purpose of the NATO was to counter this new Soviet Union. I think perhaps more important to bring up for this is that Soviet Union did not sit idly by and go, oh, that's cool, you guys have an alliance against us. The Soviet Union formed its own club called the Warsaw Pact, which existed until the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Warsaw Pact had similar things. They would act together to, create unified military actions. And so we see even countries that aren't officially part of the Soviet Union, countries that are called satellite countries, like Poland, I keep mentioning, Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, were all actually allied with the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. And so Europe learned nothing from World War I don't know, was still very much divided into these clear alliances. So I have here just some text from each of the treaties. Take a minute, read this over, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the NATO treaty, the blue one, compares to the Warsaw Pact treaty, the red one. So just take a second, read it over. I just want your thoughts, your observations. How do these two visions for alliance systems compare to each other? You're just taking a minute, looking over. What do you think as you look at these two alliance treaties side by side? All right, thoughts, observations, reflections. What do we think, Aiden?
The NATO one is talking about both individual and collective security, whereas the Warsaw Pact is talking only about collective security, which leads to quote-unquote collective security for only the most valued nations, whereas the other ones are just getting used as the quote-unquote breadbasket to protect Russia and these other key countries.
Yeah, so there's a sense in NATO we get, the language is just a little more acknowledging of individual states versus the sense of kind of one state. What else?
NATO ones are built a lot more like retaliatory actions with the Warsaw Pact and more like mutual aid, like collective defense.
Yeah, so, you know, Warsaw Pact from just reading the text sounds pretty cool, like mutual aid, friendship. I don't know, I like friendship, I like mutual aid, whereas there is an aggressive undertone in NATO and in back.
It kind of sounds like liberalism versus realism because like, the first one is basically kind of more optimistic, and the second one is basically we need to build up defense measures to prevent attack.
Yeah, so, and I think it's important to, as we're talking about NATO in debates today, to keep in mind the language that was used in the original treaty. And I think how we interpret the language can tell us a lot about the views of international relations that the writers had and how they viewed the world. So the world is a dangerous place, but we need to work together, and if we work together, maybe we can survive this dangerous place. So we did that, boop. All right, so just a quick summary of the role that Ukraine played during the Cold War proper. So we're talking 1945 to 1991, so 50-year time span. And as somebody mentioned in the beginning, Ukraine was really like the gem of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is centrally located, you're right on the Black Sea. Ukraine has some of the best farmland in that part of the world. It's huge, it's wealthy. A lot of the Soviet defense industries and military bases were actually based out of the Ukraine. So for most of the Cold War, Americans saw Kiev as, you know, a top adversary, and Kiev was to be feared as much as Moscow. And so here we see a picture of modern day Kiev. Oh, it's so beautiful. And a farmer. And one of the concerns, again, is what is going to happen to the food supply for Europe as this war continues on. And in my mind, I'm always thinking of like, what would happen if Midwest was no longer able to produce agriculture for the United States, even though most of the stuff grown in the Midwest feeds other animals that become hamburgers and stuff, but I digress. If you don't get everything, I'm gonna send it out, so don't worry. It is important to know, though, that even at the height of the Cold War and all throughout all of this, there still was always this active population in Ukraine and of Ukrainians who didn't identify as Russian, who were anti-Moscow. And this is not just true in Ukraine, right? This is throughout the Soviet Union. And so here we see a demonstration in 1984, so like the height of like Reagan. You know, I was alive then. I remember being terrified of Russia. I remember everything on TV was like, Russia is going to kill us and nuke us any day. And it was a really scary time. And even during that really scary time, here we see in DC, Ukrainians protesting Moscow. So you got to be pretty brave, I think, to stand up and protest Russia historically. So, and one of the things, if you read the text below, it talks about how consistently Moscow has tried to Russify the Ukrainian people. That's part of the cultural genocide, forcing the Ukrainian people to speak Russian, to learn Russian history. Just like we see in other instances of cultural genocide, the Russians did things like forced Ukrainians to go to schools where they weren't allowed to speak their native language or practice their native customs. We see things where like Russians would move people from Moscow to overpopulate other centers so that Russia would become the predominant culture. So similar tactics we see in other places that engage in what we might call cultural genocide. All right, yes, history done. Let's get to modern Ukraine and everyone's favorite time in history, the 90s. I wish I'd been a little bit older when the Berlin Wall fell. This is probably the best visual of, so here we see these Soviet troops that are like, are we supposed to stop this? Are we not? Because for most of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall honestly kept people from leaving East Germany. Life in West Germany was a little bit nicer. There was more access to food. There was more access to modern technology and global culture. And so in many ways, the wall kept people in, more so than keeping people out. But again, families hadn't been able to see family members for like 50 years. Once the wall went up, it was very difficult to go back and forth. So even if you had family on the other side of the wall, oh well. But we see the Berlin Wall fall in 1990, and pretty quickly, Ukraine, it's kind of crazy how quickly the Soviet Union falls. But Ukraine is one of the first to declare itself independent in December of 1991. And this is important. Putin, another weird thing I have in common with Putin, there's not very much, is Putin loves history. Putin is aware of history. This date, we just passed the 30-year anniversary. It is, some people have estimated that like Putin was very intentional about when he chose to take action. For Putin, the fall of the Soviet Union was the worst thing ever to happen in Russian history, and we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of that event. And so I do think that the moment in time we're living in is an important anniversary. And as Dr. Chase mentioned, one of the crazy things that happened is that all of those Soviet nukes, a good chunk of them had been in Ukraine, right? Kiev is one of the places that Washington was always worried was going to strike us. And so numbers vary. It's not like Russia was sending us like reports of how many they have, but an estimated, 12 to 1,900 nuclear weapons were left in the Ukraine. And this was like a really chaotic time. People didn't know who was in charge. People didn't know who they were taking orders from. People didn't know if they should show up to work. It's estimated that a lot of military officers who were working in bases would just take things and leave, maybe see if they could sell it on the illicit market. So it really was a free-for-all. But we were very aware that there was a huge stockpile of weapons in Ukraine. Something had to be done. And Dr. Chase mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. And this is huge. I think when we talk about NATO's obligations and America's obligation to protect Ukraine, the more I read about the Budapest Memorandum, the more complicated I feel about our obligations. I mean, generally, I don't know, I don't think it's our business to police or save the world. But in 1994, here we see Bill Clinton. I ran the Clinton dissent back in my day. And the concern was what to do with these Soviet weapons. So the United States and England sat down with Russia and Ukraine, also Belarus and Kazakhstan, and said, all right, just like Ramon said earlier, everyone here agrees that all of these weapons that are in former Soviet Republic will be given back to Russia. Russia will dismantle them, and then we all pinky swear to respect these new national borders and the sovereignty of these new independent republics. And so Russia was explicitly prohibited from threatening or using military force. We know how that turned out. But again, this is important context. The United States was part of this agreement. We made a commitment. Now, this is not a NATO commitment, but this was an American commitment. Made several administrations ago, but it's worth keeping in mind. How long do we have to hold our commitments for? What does it mean to hold a political commitment in a changing world? Here you can see there's really cool pictures. If you want to Google on your own, like what the dismantling process of weapons was like. And this was at a time globally when America was dismantling a bunch of our weapons. This was really like the happy flower heyday of nuclear disarmament. We had all the cool, like START treaties. Maybe we might just end this scary nuclear age. 90s had great clothes, great music, and a little bit of optimism, like, yeah, we got this. That didn't last. All right. So, this new baby independent country, Ukraine, got rid of its nuclear weapons. I meant to show you one of my favorite, there's this huge New York Times article that we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum. And there's a lot of people now saying, well, if Ukraine had held on to those weapons, we wouldn't be here today. But in return, and I think Dr. Chase mentioned this, NATO at least starts talking to Ukraine. So NATO, you have the official in dark blue, the official NATO countries. These are all the ones that have the secret decoder rings and are subject to Article 5 alliance protection. But then there's all of these other countries that NATO will invite to the lunch table occasionally. So NATO will share information with these countries. NATO will do interoperability exercises to make sure that my military could work with your military just in case. Maybe NATO will educate or share technology with partner countries, but there's no commitment with a partner country. You invite them to the table, you can kick them out at any time, there's no promises of alliance. And Ukraine gets invited to sit at the table in '94, and so does Russia. So bold move, NATO, inviting Russia to the table. Again, 90s, we were foolishly optimistic. But Russia's actually considered a NATO partner for peace until 2014, when it's pretty obvious that Russia is not interested in peace. So once the 90s are over and we get into the 21st century, we start to see things spiral pretty quickly and with increased instability. So one thing, and you're probably I don't want to do the math, but you're probably too young to remember this if you were even alive, is what was called the color revolutions in a lot of the former Soviet states. And these were generally peaceful protest movements. Because again, just because the Soviet Union fell didn't mean that all of those people in power who had been corrupt, who were used to being part of a corrupt system, they didn't disappear. And so there was still this tendency for corrupt government, even as these new republics formed. These new republics did not get off to a perfect start. It was messy. And so we see about a decade into these new republics, color revolutions, where the people are like, hey, we left the Soviet Union because we were sick of corrupt courts. We left the Soviet Union because we were sick of wealth inequality. You need to actually change. And so there were peaceful revolutions throughout Georgia, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Kyrgyzstan. And obviously the one that's important for us today is the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. It's kind of a crazy story, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce the names of the candidates. But there had been a presidential election during this time, and many people felt that the presidential election was rigged from the get-go. You had two candidates. You had one candidate that was very pro-Moscow, pro-buddy-buddy with Russia, and then you had another candidate who was into more of an independent Ukraine, and I'm going to totally mispronounce their names, but you had Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as the buddy-buddy to Moscow, and then you had Viktor Yushchenko, who was seen as the more independent Ukrainian, and Yushchenko lost. And people were like, there's no way, this was not a fair election. So they had a re-election. Why am I forgetting what that's called? The recount? It wasn't a recount. They had another election, and people were like, still, no, there's no way. And so they began the Orange Revolution. They began taking to the streets. We can see here, thousands and thousands of people in the street. At this time, the international community is paying attention. The international community is also like, yeah, we actually agree with the Ukrainian people. That election was pretty sketchy. We don't agree that those election results are valid. And so the Ukrainian Supreme Court organizes another election with international monitors at polling stations, making sure that everything is on the up and up. And this time, we actually do see Yushchenko win. Although history is funny because a few years later, the people democratically elected Yanukovych anyways, but history is weird. Whoops, wrong one. So in 2008, now that Ukraine has made this double down commitment to democracy, Ukraine really seems to be aligning itself more with the West. At 2008, Ukraine had a president that was very pro-West. And so NATO thought, you know what? Maybe let's start a membership action plan. Let's think about what we can do to bring NATO and Georgia into the official club. So before this, Ukraine, Georgia had just been partners for peace. There was no protection alliance. There was just information sharing and friendly words. But in 2008, things are looking really optimistic. But of course, the universal spoiler, Russia said no. And again, it's always a fear. How much do we want to poke the bear? And so at this time, President Bush Jr. And the NATO partners decided, it's not worth the risk. Russia is clearly furious, and we're going to get to some of their rhetoric in a second on this. So, yeah, Ukraine, we like you, we like what you're about. Good job, becoming more democratic, but sorry, not going to happen. And I think this was like the last time that there was honest hope that Ukraine was going to be added into NATO. I mean, the conversation comes up all the time, but in my opinion, 2008 was probably the closest Ukraine ever got to joining NATO as an official partner, which means that they would have had Article 5 protection. And getting back to history is weird. So Ukraine didn't get into the NATO club, so Ukraine is still kind of on its own. There's still all of these internal tensions in Ukraine. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? Are we allied with Russia? Are we allied with the West? And so Yanukovych, who we saw in the Orange Revolution, actually does somehow get reelected. I don't know. I didn't vote for him because I wasn't there. And he is seen as being super buddy-buddy with Putin. He is seen as being essentially a puppet for Russia. And out of seemingly nowhere in 2014, he steps up and says, you know what? Not only are we happy that we're not in NATO, but we don't want to be part of the EU, and we really want to increase our relationship with Russia. right? I know, thank you. All right, how are we doing? Am I back online? Haha, Putin foiled yet again. Although if you don't see me tomorrow, we all know what happened. All right, so we know in 2014, Russia annexes Crimea. And again, the justification was, this government isn't legit anyways. This government had this sketchy coup. Nobody should be supporting the Ukrainian government anyway. So Moscow used that justification to seize Crimea, strategically located right here in the Black Sea. Remember, most of the goods that are sold throughout the world are transported by barge. So we always underestimate how important ship travel is. But ship travel is really important, right? Those TVs, those phones, that stuff we're getting from Asia and all over the world at some point has been on a barge. And you need to be able to have ports like those in the Black Sea to get goods into regions. And so obviously this is a strategic region to connect the rest of Europe to Asia. And Russia's acquisition of it was a pretty big deal. Dr. Chase mentioned this was the first time since World War II that a European nation had redrawn the borders of another European nation. The whole reason we created NATO was because there was a sense that there needed to be peace in Europe. You know, for centuries, Europeans had been fighting over borders, fighting over who controlled what area. World War II was the awful ultimate culmination in that. So NATO and a lot of the other alliances that came out of World War II were an attempt to just keep borders that we all can agree on and that we can all resolve peacefully. And it worked for half a decade, but now we see in 2014 that those rules are out. And we know that more than 14,000 people have died. So Moscow not only took over this land, but made sure to bring in troops and forces that continued to essentially spread pro-Russian propaganda and really support people who, because especially in this part of the country, you do have a lot of ethnic Russians. You do have a lot of people in this part of the country who have families, you know, going back and forth. And there were definitely people in this part of the country who wanted to be part of Greater Russia. And so now that Crimea has been seized, Russia was making sure that those people who are sympathetic to Moscow had resources, that their voices were amplified. We're now in the age of Facebook. Facebook plays a huge role in a lot of these revolutions because people were able to communicate. So does anyone know, what does NATO do? Russia seizes Crimea. What does NATO do? Oh, NATO. So first, well, I don't know. First, NATO loves to have meetings. So NATO does have a meeting. And, you know, they decide, well, let's at least double down on our security commitment. So I guess that's not nothing, right? So NATO does double down that, you know, we're going to continue to educate Ukraine. We're going to continue to supply information, and we care about Ukraine. Countries like the United States begin sanctioning Russia at this time with NATO support. But yeah, that's kind of about it for the NATO action. So here we see the result of that meeting. While people are, you know, dying in the Donbas region. Let's see, where do I have? I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit because I want to show. Where's the? Yep. So here's some statements that NATO put in response. So this is from the NATO website. These are official NATO statements. So if you want to know some of the things that NATO did, you know, straight from the horse's mouth. This was NATO's response starting in 2014. So a condemnation of Russia. There is an increased presence in the Black Sea. NATO stands with the people of Ukraine. And yes, I recognize I am a little biased on this, but when I think about this, I think of, the same people who see school shootings and say thoughts and prayers. Like, to me, this feels a little bit like NATO sending thoughts and prayers to the people of Ukraine. And that's about it. I mean, there are some exercises in the Black Sea. Ukraine continues to get information. NATO, since 2014, has continued to make these public proclamations condemning Russia, wagging its finger. How dare you, Russia? Bad Russia. Don't invade stuff again. That's kind of it. Which brings us to the present, the war in Ukraine. I'm not going to go in depth. I'm not somebody who's obsessed with like battles and military history. If that's your jam, I did put some articles in the bibliography that go through like battle by battle. But I think it's important just to know where we are, why Russia cares. So obviously we have the two big players. Dr. Chase talked a little bit about Putin, former KGB officer, pretty universally accepted to be part of some pretty horrific human rights abuses. He is the longest serving leader in Europe. He is known for crushing dissent. Again, like Dr. Chase mentioned, it's illegal to protest in Russia. You still see Russians, protesting, but they are taking their lives in their own hand. It's very risky. And then Ukraine now is led by this kind of like scrappy newcomer. He wasn't a politician, Volodymyr Zelensky. Overwhelmingly popular, 72% of the popular vote. Does anyone know what Zelensky was doing before he was oh yes, you all know this. What was he? He was an actor, he was a comedian, so I don't know. I did put in the bibliography, he's amazing. Like I don't know, I'm a big fan. He gave a really powerful statement after Russia invaded. It's about 15 minutes, so we don't have time to see it. But I really encourage you, and I show it in my debate class, to watch Zelensky's plea to the world, where he asks the world for help right after the invasion. He's incredibly just thoughtful, articulate. It is a hard to watch video because war is brutal and awful. Oh, it is on Netflix? Okay, I should watch. I mean, like, as somebody who loves politics, I sometimes get depressed because a lot of politicians these days are cause for depression. But Zelensky, I don't know, I'm completely biased in my opinion, but Zelensky gives me hope in like politics, diplomacy. Watch the video I put in here. Like, I think it's just interesting context, and maybe it'll make you join the Zelensky fan club if you're not already in there. So we know February, just over 100 days ago, Russia started to prepare for an invasion, and we know this because of things like satellite images. We could see Russia moving supplies and troops, essentially encircling Ukraine. And the chutzpah of Putin, right? And February 17th, Putin reminds President Biden and the West of Russia's demand, reminding us that Ukraine must never, ever join NATO or else. And so this had really been like the statement, definitely since 2014, but really since the inception of the independent Ukraine. And Putin makes sure to remind the West of this on February 17th. And February 18th, a day later, Russia cooperates with a Belarusian government that is sympathetic to Moscow in conducting exercises. So bringing a bunch of troops to Belarus along the Ukrainian border. Oh no, it's just practice. We're just doing military drills. And like we do military exercises all the time, all over the world. But in this military exercise, we also see like, troops, ballistic missile technology lining up along the Ukrainian border. So not great. Obviously, President Biden in the West completely ignores Putin's demands. They're ridiculous, not going to happen. We know on February 24th, the Russian troops begin the assault from 3 sides. So in the north, coming down from Belarus, from the east, coming in across the Russian border, and now that Russia has secured Crimea in the south, bringing up from the south. So this is very much Russia had played the long game. You know, it took almost a decade to encircle Ukraine, but we do see in the conflict today that Russian forces are able to really come in from all sides. The one thing I always say is important in warfare is I think we forget that normal life goes on for people in warfare, that like when war happens in places, people still have to go about their normal lives. And when I see the pictures of cities in Ukraine, Mariupol and everything, I think of my own city in Chicago. And I think it's just really important to always contextualize the fact that like, this is just a city where, and I showed you that picture at the very beginning of Kiev, this is just a street in a downtown, does it say which city this is in? Kharkov. So this could be any street in any city. And so I think it's a useful exercise to just imagine, you know, in a street in your city having armored vehicles. Here we see like a school in the city, and suddenly there's, you know, Russian militia in front of the school with the Russian flags. A train station. And I always think we forget about the humanity in war, and I bring this up because I do think there's a lot of cool, like, soft left arguments that should be talked about when talking about Ukraine. But it's important to remember that as you're picturing these cities, people are still there. People are still having to figure out how to do their day-to-day lives. Even if it means I have to sleep in the subway underground bunker at night and then come up during the day, people are still there. People are still trying to figure out how to negotiate this surreal environment. We see people becoming refugees, and those that have the capacity to flee Ukraine do start to come. So we're going to continue to see this huge refugee crisis in other parts of Europe. And we just surpassed the 100-day anniversary of the war. And so we know right now, you know, we're looking at almost 200,000 Russian troops amassed along the border. We know that Russia's done a lot of active fighting here in the Donbas region where they've been supporting separatists. We know that Ukraine proper has about 200,000 active troops. And here we see some NATO states. And so again, like this is always the red line, like if Russian soldiers were ever to step across into Poland, then we're in Article 5 territory. But otherwise, there's been a real delicate balance between how do we support Ukraine. We don't send in our own troops, but we give them weapons and help train their troops. And there's a question is, how long is this going to last? So, and you can see the areas that are like shaded pink are areas where Russian forces have been able to keep some measure of control. Many people think that Putin thought he was going to get Kiev really quickly and was completely surprised by the resistance, the intelligence, and organization. But that's not to say that there haven't been some serious, I mean, look at each one of these dots is a major city. So as I'm looking at this map, I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, that could be Kansas City, that could be St. Louis, you know, that could be Cleveland. And so we're looking at major metropolitan areas really going through some devastating, and they're still fighting throughout the rest of Ukraine as well. So we did this. Finally, why does Russia care about Ukraine? I think we talked about we talked about 3 of these. So one is there's a sense that Ukraine shares a history. 2, Ukraine was the gem of the Soviet states, and Putin and those who think about the historic Russian Empire were always really salty about losing that prestige. We talked about access to the Black Sea and the wealthy consumers. Ukraine also, being that geographical connector between Russia and the rest of Europe, Ukraine was the byway that Russia counted on to get its natural gas to the rest of Europe. One of the reasons why Russia has become so powerful in modern times is because you can make a lot of money selling gas. And Russia happens to have a lot of it, needs to get it through Europe. Now, Russia did develop this Nord Stream pipeline, which actually goes underground. And especially now that they've started war on Ukraine, so the Nord pipeline was supposed to come online, but now that like Russia has started this aggression, countries like Germany that are part of the project, they're like, oh, we're not going to help you, turn it on. And so without the Nord Stream pipeline, Russia is really dependent on Ukraine to make sure that its oil gets to Europe and Russia stays wealthy. And you can read a little bit about just like how crazy wealthy Putin and some of his friends have become because the oil industries are state-owned, unlike in the United States where they're owned by corporations. Oil is owned by the state in Russia. And so here we see an example of why the Black Sea is so important. So again, imagine, I want to bring my consumer products into a port in this city, but if there's contested control and countries are bringing naval ships in, how am I supposed to get my consumer goods in? And then here we see the Nord pipeline, part of its assembly. So you'll probably find a lot of stuff about the Nord Stream pipeline in your evidence. Ooh. And before I give my argument considerations, I guess for the last few minutes I wanted to throw it out to you. How does this fit into everything else we've been talking about? What are some arguments or considerations that we can take, knowing now what we know about Ukraine, knowing what we know about what NATO has and hasn't done? What are some arguments or considerations? Just take a second. Let the wheels in your brain turn. I want to hear what you all think of. How does this fit? Any thoughts? How does this fit? Yes? Who needs justifications? Yeah, so a lot of you have been reading some of the NATO bad cards, and I think looking at and understanding the history of NATO, maybe you can make an argument about like why NATO is bad, why some of the things that we're seeing maybe are justified. What are some other arguments or considerations? Yes, sir.
Focusing on Taiwan increases the strength of Russia.
Yeah, and how so?
Because if Russia successfully invades Ukraine, then they gain all of that.
Mm-hmm. So it's super important, whether it's through the United States unilaterally or whether it's through international organizations, we can't take our eye off of what's going on in Russia. And we know that like we live in an age where people and the globe and politicians have short attention spans, right? Like we all are talking about the war in Ukraine now, but if the war continues, are we going to continue focusing on it and paying attention to it? And historically, the United States is not always great at paying attention to one or two things. And so maybe if we take our eye off of what's going on in Ukraine, that's going to allow Russia to dominate, even though there might be some serious things going on in the Pacific and in Taiwan. What other arguments, considerations? Yes?
That Russia probably won't add other territories because it's trade-specific, because there is like specific benefits to that territory, and it also took them a long time to actually make it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, I think that's a debate I'd love to sit in. I think an argument can be made that Russia doesn't have ambitions past Ukraine. Like Ukraine was the prize. Russia's going to get Ukraine. It's awful. It's a human rights travesty. But we don't need to think of this as like, a European domination. Like we need to put it in perspective. What else?
I think it kind of makes a lot of stuff, it's really up in the air right now because it's like, what happens in a week if there's a major development in Ukraine? Could all of the evidence talking about Russia be outdated? And also it's like, is there a possibility of like a full-scale war where it's like, so there's just like a lot of uncertainty and also there's a lot
Yeah, so the story is changing rapidly. I haven't seen the newspaper today, but I imagine there's been updates today. And so what is the international community doing? So far, NATO is sending thoughts and prayers. NATO is sharing information. NATO member countries are helping send supplies. That could change, and we don't know. And as this continues, the story continues to unfold, we do hear about things of like, Russian forces using human rights atrocities like rape and mass slaughter of civilians. And so is there going to be a point where the international community has to change its reaction? It's going to change on a pretty fluid basis. Any other thoughts, considerations? Yes? Yeah, so we know that there's this constant dance and like what is going to be the backlash? What is going to be the response? I think you all got some of the main ones that y'all are good at creating arguments, that's why you're debaters. I do think that there's an important human rights story going on, and I think one of the questions is always, what obligations does the United States and international organizations have to intercede on behalf of human rights? And so, like in my debate class, we talk a lot about the Uyghurs in China and like, at what point are we going to step in defense of the Uyghurs? And I think a similar conversation should be held with Ukraine. We know that Russia has been trying to execute cultural genocide in the region for over a century. There's valid reports of mass rape, mass civilian casualties, massive human rights violations taking place right now. What is our obligation to step in on the basis of human rights? I think some of you talked about what's going to be the turning point. Is it going to be a certain city falling? Is it going to be troops surrounding Kiev? What is going to be the turning point where we're going to say NATO is at war with Russia, US is at war with Russia? And then I think this begs some of the essential questions of like, we have this liberal idea for the past century that diplomacy and alliances can really work through some of the toughest problems and disagreements in the world. And that's been this very like hopeful tenor of the global community for the past century. And I think now is a really important test. What power does diplomacy have? What are the limits of international law and international agreements? What is the purpose of NATO? If NATO was created to counter Russia, like this seems like a test for what NATO was created for, right? And so if NATO is not going to declare war on Russia in this instance, then I think it's a really valid question. So what is NATO then? What is its purpose? What is its vision? And I think these are at least interesting conversations you should be having, things that can come up in cross-ex. And again, I put a lot of reading in the bibliography to help you sift through this. So I believe that was everything. I love talking history. Feel free to reach out to me. Any questions, comments? All right. See, and look at that. I get you to lunch with 1 extra minute. All right, have a great weekend.